Our first panel will be moderated by Roy Austin in a minute. And as the panel is speaking, we've put cards inside of your folders. So please feel free to write questions for the panelists, hand them down towards the middle, and there'll be people to pick them up in the center aisle, and then they'll give them to Roy, and he will read them. So, ladies and gentlemen, Roy Austin, Deputy Assistant Attorney General.
Well, good morning. Good morning. I'm sorry. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, this is not a wake. All right? This is an opportunity to discuss an incredibly exciting issue, a sad issue, but one where there's a great deal of hope. And I hope that we will leave with exactly that hope at the end of the day. Unfortunately, I'm here to talk about the past. And as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, my job is to supervise the work of our hate crimes unit, our religious discrimination piece, as well as our law enforcement parts, which include where law enforcement is engaged in discriminatory or unconstitutional conduct. But what I have for you today is a group of speakers who know what has been done in the past 10 years, to address these problems and to deal with them effectively and quickly, and hopefully make the next 10 years one where we don't have to deal with these problems. So let me introduce the speakers by the order at which they will be speaking to you. First, you will hear from Ralph Boyd. He is the Executive Vice President, Community Relations for Freddie Mac, and a member of the company's management committee. He also is president and CEO of the Freddie Mac Foundation, overseeing one of the National Capital Region's largest philanthropic programs. Boyd previously served as Freddie Mac's general counsel and head of its external relations and public affairs functions, and director of 2 Freddie Mac-affiliated real estate investment trusts. From 2001 to 2003, Mr. Boyd was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. He later served for 3 years as the U.S. member of the Geneva-based UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, a United Nations Human Rights Treaty body. Prior to coming to Washington, D.C., Mr. Boyd was a partner in the Boston law firm of Goodwin Procter, having previously spent 6 years as an AUSA, an Assistant United States Attorney, in the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office. Mr. Boyd is a graduate of Haverford College and Harvard Law School. Next, you will hear from Stuart J. Ishimaru. Stuart, or Mr. Ishimaru, has been a member of the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, since 2003. He was designated by President Obama as acting chairman of the commission on January 20th, 2009, and served in that role until April 7th of 2010. As acting chairman, Mr. Ishimaru worked to rebuild the EEOC, which had become underfunded and understaffed. Under his leadership, the agency obtained record budgets from the Congress and embarked on an aggressive hiring initiative to significantly increase its frontline enforcement staff. Mr. Ishimaru worked to reinvigorate the agency's emphasis on race discrimination issues. He also was instrumental in the Commission's adoption of groundbreaking guidance and best practices to help employers avoid engaging in gender and disability discrimination against workers who have caregiving responsibilities. Mr. Ishimaru previously served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division, and he did so from 1999 to 2001. He supervised high-profile litigation, including employment discrimination cases, fair housing and fair lending cases, criminal police misconduct, hate crime and slavery prosecutions, and enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. From 1994 to 1999, Mr. Ishimaru served as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General. In 1993, Mr. Ishimaru was appointed by President Clinton to be the acting staff director at the Commission on Civil Rights. And from 1984 to 1993, he served on the professional staffs of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil and Constitutional Rights and 2 House Armed Services Subcommittees of Congress. Mr. Ishimaru received his AB, because in California they reverse everything, at the University of California, Berkeley, and his JD from this law school. Next, you'll be hearing from Ms. Amber Khan. Ms. Khan is a founding board member of Muslim Advocates and currently serves as the corporate secretary. Ms. Khan has participated in a variety of efforts to address anti-Muslim bias and racial religious profiling. During her tenure as chief executive of the Communications Network, Khan led the South Asian Muslim Strategic Communications Collaboration, a civil rights awareness project supported by the Ford Foundation. The initiative grew from Ms. Khan's issue advocacy and coalition organizing efforts in the days after 9/11. Active in many philanthropic and advocacy organizations, she currently serves as a director on the board of the Interfaith Alliance Foundation and the National Program Advisory Board of the Council for America's First Freedom. She has served on the advisory board of the Opportunity Agenda, the Communications Committee of the Forum of Regional Association of Grantmakers, the Board of Asian Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, the Board of South Asian American Leading Together, and on the Public Affairs Committee of the Council on Foundations. You will next hear from Amardeep Singh. Mr. Singh is the co-founder of the Sikh Coalition, the largest Sikh civil rights organization in the United States. He currently serves as its director of programs, where he oversees the coalition's use of litigation, advocacy, community organizing, and strategic communications to advance social justice goals. And finally, you will hear from Dr. James Zogby, the author of Arab Voices and the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based organization which serves as the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community. Since 1985, Dr. Zogby and AAI have led Arab American efforts to secure political empowerment in the United States. Through voter registration, education, and mobilization, AAI has moved Arab Americans into the political mainstream. For the past 3 decades, Dr. Zogby has been involved in a full range of Arab American issues, a co-founder and chairman of the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in the late 1970s. He later co-founded and served as the executive director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. In 1982, he co-founded Save Lebanon, Incorporated, a private nonprofit, humanitarian and non-sectarian relief organization which funds health care for Palestinians and Lebanese victims of war and other social welfare projects in Lebanon. In 1985, Dr. Zogby founded AAI. And with that, I give you former Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Ralph Boyd.
Thank you very much, Roy. Thank you to you and to Eric Treen for the concept and the preparation and the formulation and hopefully the successful execution of today's program. This is a very important subject that we address. It was important back in 2001 and it continues to be important today and deserves our very best consideration, thinking, and attention. So thank you to you, Roy, and to Eric. And also thank you to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Deputy Attorney General Cole, Dean Berman, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Tom Perez. I think their presence here today and their active participation in our program really underscore the importance of why we're here today. And also thank you to my fellow distinguished panelists. I want to share with you one personal thought before I get into the substance of what I want to say, and I want to move quickly because I want to respect our time and the other panelists and give you a full opportunity to ask questions and presumably us to respond to them sufficiently. But I just want to say today's subject certainly brings back many difficult memories for me, difficult memories for those of us who were in the Department of Justice at the time, difficult memories for America, and especially difficult memories for members of affected and vulnerable communities, of our Muslim, our Arab, our Sikh, and our South Asian communities. It certainly does that, but I want you to keep in mind as I speak that from my perspective, it also brings back some joyful and satisfying memories. And I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but I think it's important to say because it's real, and I want to say Why? And it's because it was compelling, inspiring, motivating to be privileged to be part of meeting the challenge and finding solutions to that mutually reinforcing goal that the Deputy Attorney General mentioned of promoting and providing for the national security while also enforcing effectively and vigorously our civil rights and really advocating loudly and compellingly for our human rights principles. So that was joyful and satisfying, but so were the development of the relationships that was necessary for us to try to be able to do that effectively. Relationships that in many instances commenced for me back in 2001 with members of affected and vulnerable communities and relationships which continue today. And that's the joyful part of this otherwise difficult message and difficult time. So let me start by saying when the attacks of September 11th occurred, obviously, this is obvious, but it bears saying at the outset, we didn't have a template at the Department of Justice for dealing with the multitude of issues with which we were confronted in that instance. And so we had to develop one on the fly. And so let me talk a little bit about what the elements of that template were, and then also talk about what we did, and then talk about the results and the outcomes that we observed or perceived or believed occurred at that time, and then leave some other perspective for our other panelists. The first element of our response or of our template, both as prosecutors and law enforcement and advocates, if you will, for human rights and for civil rights, was for the executive branch and the Department of Justice in particular to make a very clear and plain statement to the American people. The president got out and spoke immediately, as did the Attorney General, as did FBI Director Bob Mueller, and me as well. And I'm not going to read those statements to you. They're online, and you can find them if you're interested in seeing the specific text of those statements. But the elements of those statements were really important, each and every one of them. And the first element, the first message we wanted to convey about our principles, about our values, and about our commitment was to encourage the American people not to tolerate difference and diversity in people from affected and vulnerable communities, but rather to embrace them as being us, as being part of us. I have never, especially in this context of diversity and inclusion, liked the word tolerance because there is an inherent aspect of tolerance that suggests a kind of you're enduring something, you're grudgingly putting up with it. And that didn't seem to me to set the right tone. What we were talking about was embracing us, embracing Muslim and Arab and Sikh and South Asian Americans and welcome guests to America who are a critical part of who we are and who we were. And we thought it was important to say that very clearly and unequivocally. Also, we thought it was important to remind Americans that Muslims and Arabs and Sikhs and South Asians, Americans and welcome guests, were also victims of the 9/11 attacks, and they were also first responders as well. And we thought it was important to say that, again, to say this is part of who we are. These are not outsiders who we just simply tolerate. And then finally, we thought it was also very important to encourage the embrace of these values that I mentioned, but we also thought it was equally important to send a very clear warning to those people who were not committed to playing by the rules and living within the law, and to say very clearly to them what our commitment was. And that commitment was, if you break the law, if you discriminate, if you threaten, if you commit acts of violence, we will find you and we will prosecute you fairly, but certainly. So we thought it was important to say that. We also thought it was critically important to have boots on the ground and conduct outreach to vulnerable people and communities. We thought that there was a lot of what I'll describe as multilateral learning and communication that needed to go on to identify issues and concerns in those vulnerable communities. Obviously, there was a need to identify and protect victims of backlash discrimination, and what we did was create something of a risk assessment matrix, priority matrix in our head to kind of sort these issues by level of immediacy and severity, starting with the most serious criminal type concerns, and then moving to lower immediate threat, but certainly important unlawful discrimination issues. So let's see what's out there. Let's survey the landscape. Let's look at the most severe stuff that requires our attention first, the criminal violence, the threats of violence, and then move down the continuum to address other important backlash discrimination matters. That required on-the-ground intel and learning about victims and also about continuing threats to our national security. We then, of course, had to develop a plan of action for investigating and prosecuting backlash crimes and other non-criminal but certainly important unlawful discrimination. And then also, we certainly had to, and this was a big part of the early efforts in particular, we had to coordinate and integrate and align all these activities, not just within the Civil Rights Division or within the Department of Justice or even within the federal government apparatus, but also, importantly, amongst and including law enforcement and anti-discrimination agencies in literally hundreds of state and local municipalities across the country. So those were kind of the principal elements of the template. So what did we do? Well, one of the first things we did was start to hold a series of meetings with representatives of various important organizations that represented the interests and the concerns of the Muslim and Arab and Sikh and South Asian communities. And some of those, we're honored to be joined by some of those folks today. Jim Zogby, the then and continuing distinguished president of the Arab American Institute, Armadeep Singh, the president of the Sikh American Coalition, and you'll hear from them. They were an important element of our outreach, but we also reached out to so many other leaders in affected communities as well. All told, I think in the first several months following September 11th, DOJ leaders attended about between 100 and 110 meetings and events involving members of affected communities. That included Attorney General Ashcroft, FBI Director Mueller, Sherry Freeman, who was the Director of the Community Relations Service, Lori Sharp Day, the Director of Intergovernmental Relations, and me, including various U.S. attorneys out in the 90-plus federal districts out across our country. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, President Bush visited the Islamic Center here in Washington, D.C. Attorney General Ashcroft and I attended an iftar dinner, a memorable one, where the Attorney General was presented with his own personal copy of the Quran. I held numerous town hall meetings across America, as did various United States attorneys in their own communities, spoke at many luncheons and dinners, including ones that honored, and I thought very importantly, members of the Muslim and Arab communities who were first responders on September 11th. And so that was an important part of our work. More concretely to our law enforcement responsibilities, and the Deputy Attorney General alluded to this earlier, we created a special backlash crime task force that was staffed with some of the most experienced federal prosecutors within the federal system, both from the criminal section within the Civil Rights Division, as well as assistant U.S. attorneys within the various U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. They were responsible for creating a clearinghouse for documenting complaints of threats of violence and actual violence, investigating those acts of violence or threats of violence, referring cases to state and local prosecutors where appropriate, and then in fact instituting federal prosecutions where the severity and the law and the facts warranted federal prosecutions. In conjunction with that, we also created a backlash discrimination team within our already existing national origin working group within the Civil Rights Division, and their task was similar to the criminal task force. They were literally empowered to do the same with respect to what would amount to civil discrimination complaints. They documented the backlash discrimination landscape for us. They provided information to relevant state and local investigative agencies and service providers so that victims of backlash discrimination could get referrals to organizations that could provide supportive services. I also conducted, as I said, town hall meetings in Arab American and Muslim communities across our country. And in certain instances where appropriate, I was able to intervene in various detention proceedings and deportation proceedings where the facts and circumstances seemed to warrant it in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. So what were the outcomes and results? And I'll go through this very, very quickly. In the months immediately following September 11th, we investigated more than 350 criminal complaints. They resulted in over 70 state and local criminal prosecutions, 12 high-profile priority federal prosecutions involving cases involving the firebombing of a Seattle mosque, the firebombing of a Salt Lake City Pakistani restaurant, the murder of a Sikh gas station attendant in Mesa, Arizona, and telephone threats that were made to Jim Zogby, the president of the Arab American Institute. That's the bad news. The good news is the bulk of the criminal complaints and activity and allegations of backlash discrimination, the overwhelming bulk occurred in the first 3 weeks following September 11th. And if I was to graph out for you the quantitative data that reflected both the volume of criminal complaints and the volume of civil discrimination complaints, you'll see that there's a huge cliff in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, and then a dramatically diminishing volume of complaints thereafter. Now, that doesn't mean the show is over, and as we all know, our work continued then, and it continues today in earnest. And you'll hear this afternoon from Assistant Attorney General Perez about how that work continues today. I'm also happy to say that one of the epilogues or continuing stories to what we did in the immediate aftermath of September 11th was to create the position of Special Counsel for Religious Discrimination. And we had the good sense and judgment to hire and retain Eric Treen at the time. And Assistant Attorney General Perez has continued that good judgment by keeping Eric on board and continuing to support his very important work. And some of that work was detailed by the Deputy Attorney General earlier today. Much, much more to talk about, but I think that gives you a rough outline of what the immediate challenges were in the aftermath of September 11th, and at least a schematic of what we tried to accomplish. And let me just leave you with this thought. In the aftermath of September 11th, there was a lot to do. In the months that followed, there was more to do, and there continues to be much to do today to restore and retain the full faith and credit that people have in our ability and in our willingness to embrace and to protect vulnerable people and community in our midst who are robust and vibrant parts of who we are.
People warned me Ralph would be a hard act to follow, but I will try. You know, we all have our stories, and for me and for the EEOC, this 9/11 impacted us directly. Our office in New York was in the World Trade Center, was in 7 World Trade Center, which collapsed later in the day. Our people across the river in our Newark office could see the attacks happening, and it impacted us on a personal level at the agency directly and profoundly. And over the last 10 years, we've seen this in action. I was a civilian at the time. I had served at the Department of Justice in the 90s in various jobs, and was wondering what to do next with my life. And the attacks came on September 11th. And when I was stuck in traffic in the gridlock of Washington on that day with my 2 kids in the car, my thoughts went back to a time 60 years before, after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and how my parents and their families on the west coast of California were soon thereafter taken and incarcerated in internment camps in the interior of the country. And I wondered whether something like that would indeed happen again. And you know, we knew, never having lived through anything, or for many of us, never having lived through anything like this, you know, would this be the case again, that people were rounded up and incarcerated because they looked like people who were the enemy? And I was pleased, personally, to see the leadership of the president and other administration officials at the time, including Ralph and others, who stepped up to the plate to say, no, this can't happen again, that we've grown beyond this, that Korematsu just wasn't a case you taught about in law school, but it's an active part of our jurisprudence in this country. And I was proud that that had happened, that people were speaking up. I know 3 days after the attack, our chair at the time, Carrie Dominguez, issued a strong statement saying that we need to enforce the civil rights laws, that people needed to know that employment discrimination was illegal and that people had a place to come to. And we beefed up our efforts around the country to make sure people knew that. And we could see this happening. We could see this happening in the volume of complaints that came into the EEOC charging employment discrimination in the weeks and months following the attacks. We received, in the first year, some 2.5 times the number of charges alleging employment discrimination. If you look over the long run, we see basically a tripling of complaints over the past 10 years of employment discrimination against Muslims. Many of these complaints have similar characteristics. Often they're verbal or written threats, changes in working conditions. We've seen changes where people cite the lack of accommodation for people needing religious accommodation regarding clothing or beards or other items. Some Muslim Americans, some South Asians have told us that adverse actions have happened against them based on customer preference, what customers might think when they come into establishments, and that's never allowed under the civil rights laws in our country. We heard from many people around the country that they found a dramatically different atmosphere after the attacks of 9/11. Dramatically fewer job offers, recruitment contacts, and job interviews. So what did we do? We found that one of the struggles for us at the EEOC was to actually know what was going on. And part of it is that we had to track what was going on. And in the weeks following the attacks, the chair made it clear that she wanted our people to know who was coming in the door, who was telling us their stories, so we could actually measure the impact. And there were special categories created in our tracking system so we could actually measure the impact. We weren't doing this as well before, and the chair had made this a priority. Within 3 months after the attacks, 166 formal complaints of discrimination were filed with the EEOC alleging backlash discrimination. 100 of these raised the issue of discharge, and harassment was raised in some 60 cases. We also, in December of 2001, held a meeting, part of bringing this issue to the fore, and Mr. Singh was a participant in that meeting, and as were others in this room, to make sure and to use our bully pulpit at the EEOC to say that employment discrimination on the basis of ethnicity or religion or some other factor was illegal and will continue to be illegal in this difficult period. Over the subsequent decade, EEOC, in the last 10 years, we received over 1,000 charges of backlash discrimination. 615 of those were discharge cases, and some 442 were harassment cases. California led the way with the most charges at 169, followed by Texas with 140, Florida with 67, and Arizona with 52. And what struck me as we were looking back in retrospect is that many of these charges coming in are investigated by the EEOC, and we make a finding if there is reasonable cause to believe that employment discrimination has occurred. Usually at the EEOC, that cause rate is in the single digits. And for these types of charges, it was nearly double that, 13.6%. So these charges that came in were serious charges, and we oftentimes found that an illegal activity had occurred. The other thing that we found we needed to do was to do outreach, and we did outreach with our friends from various other government agencies. We had some 23 offices located, district offices located throughout the nation. In the 1990s, we tried to expand our outreach to go beyond traditional groups who came to the EEOC. We wanted to make sure that various underserved national origin groups were included. That served us well, I think. I know during my time at the Department of Justice, we created the National Origin Working Group that Ralph talked about. And again, to make sure that we went to communities to tell them what their rights were under the law. At the EEOC, we were letting employers know what their responsibilities were. We wanted to give people news they could use, something that was fairly simple, that wasn't in bureaucratese, and that they could bring to our local office and tell their story to see if there was an issue here. And quite often, frankly, people are scared. People don't want to come in. People from immigrant communities especially. The thought of going into a government agency to file a formal complaint against an employer or another government agency is something very intimidating. And by this outreach, we tried to address issues of fear, trying to build relationships beforehand, before problems existed. We relied heavily, and still do, on non-governmental organizations, of intermediary organizations who can help us bridge that gap so we can work with various communities to make sure people are comfortable coming forward to have a relationship before a problem exists. And I think we have made progress there. This has not been an easy path, but something that over the past 10 years we believe we've made some progress on and look forward to in the course going forward. And with that, let me stop and respect the time limits so Roy doesn't pull me off. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Looking around and looking out into the audience, I can't help but remember 10 years ago. During 9/11, Muslim Advocates was not an organization that existed. Its sister charity, the National Association of Muslim Lawyers, was a volunteer-based organization of lawyers that primarily communicated by email. We were a listserv. On the day of 9/11, I was taking what I like to refer to as a mommy sabbatical. I was home with my 1-year-old son, and I had just finished working with a series of colleagues on Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Through my work with the Interfaith Alliance and People for the American Way and partners at ADL, I had put countless hours and effort into working to mobilize coalitions around the country to combat hate. My faith in our country was strong and remains strong. But on that day, I was scared. I was scared and frightened for my 11-year-old brother at the bus stop in Bartlett, Tennessee. I was scared for my 25-year-old brother driving through the rural roads of Tennessee. And I was frightened for relatives who were recent immigrants, who I knew were barely verbal and comfortable articulating their rights as Americans, and unable to fathom and comprehend the devastation and the tragedy that was taking place in their new home. It's painful. And I'm still, as I was preparing for our conversation today, thinking about how much our country has changed. How I was elected as one of two Muslims in my high school, student council president in a small southern town in a state that we now talk about and associate with hate towards Muslims. It's painful. Muslim advocates came about in part because of a recognition and a need for a national organization to help strengthen the ability and the resolve of the American Muslim community across all of our diversity to work together to call for human rights and civil rights, working specifically to ask questions and understand the policies and the strategies that we are working towards as a country to keep us safe and strong. Now I'll back up. How did that happen and why? In the first week after 9/11, there were 645 incidents of hate crimes that had been reported and tabulated by then a group known as SALT, still today known as SALT. And I got a call on September 16th from Deepa Iyer, concerned from her friends in the Asian American community, the advocates and activists, many of Japanese American descent, who had the same fears that you did, Stuart, and recognized and realized we had to do something. So on September 19th, I worked to bring together a coalition of partners and activists in front of the National Japanese American Memorial. And we stood there together and had an amazing crowd and an international audience of media hear the calls for our country to come together from activists and advocates across the aisle and from religious leaders, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, from veterans, Filipino and Japanese American veterans who'd survived the internment. And we felt strong and excited about the energy that was coming together, that our country, the feelings of hate, the feelings of backlash could be challenged with these voices. And we were heartened to see and strengthened to see our leaders and President Bush at the time speak out. But then shortly after, while we confronted hate and hate crimes targeting innocent Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim, at the same time we saw a series of policies, law enforcement policies, that were underway that were specifically targeting Muslim American communities, surveillance and religious profiling at Islamic centers and mosques, knocks on the door by FBI agents. There was fear. Many in the community turned to their civic organizations, and up until that point were volunteer-run. As I like to say, IT professional by day, religious leader at night. There was no council of religious leaders with legal or policy training within our community. There was no infrastructure within our community to begin to understand and raise questions about the policies and the disappearances of people. The disappearing detentions of American Muslims and most recent Muslim immigrants sent a chilling effect throughout the community. No one knew where to turn. And when they called, I would hear these stories, calls to the police department. My son didn't come home. My husband didn't come home. Can you help me find them? Well, let me look and see. I have no record. Oh, maybe you should call the FBI. Call the FBI. Where's my son? Where's my husband? No answer. We'll get back to you. Weeks and months. In some ways, I recently told a colleague that the internment was visible, devastating, and horrific, but visible. In the American Muslim community, we were well aware that there was a disappearance, but it wasn't visible. And the challenge of making the case to allies was even harder. I will say personally that I was a little stunned by how long it took for my friends in different spaces in the progressive community to speak out. I guess I was naive. I believed that because I had stood up, that all others would stand up quickly as well. But then I realized that there was fear. And you took a step back and you recognized that when you speak out and you question the two messages, that there's a law enforcement policy about surveillance and detention and questioning, and at the same time a challenge to hate crimes and speaking out against violence. There are two messages being sent to our country. There's some good Muslims and there's some bad Muslims. And for Muslim advocates to be able to raise questions, to immediately have your patriotism and your credibility and your willingness to commit and believe and support American values raised, made it very difficult to provide the type of advocacy and to protect the community. And we weren't alone. We had leadership who said, after the hasty passage of the Patriot Act, if you're not with us, you're against us. So yes, I agree that as a country, when the dark and dangerous signs of hate emerge, we stand up. We do. Because we know it's wrong. But when the politics and the policies that institutionalize racial and religious profiling are passed, it becomes much harder to know where and how to ask questions. And so now I'll return to the founding of Muslim Advocates. As lawyers, we recognize many of us who worked in Washington and had experience working on Capitol Hill, within the committee structure, within the nonprofit and advocacy world, understood that there was an absence and a need for an organization that could engage and participate not only in monitoring and providing a level of engagement on the policy discourse that relates to the community, but that there was also a need for us to strengthen and educate and assist in building up the civic sector of the American Muslim community. Because after all, as people were disappearing, what we immediately recognized were the organizations that were being turned to were volunteer groups with very little resources. And not unlike the nonprofit sector or the faith-based nonprofit sector, the level of structure and the ability to withstand scrutiny was difficult. And so we decided to organize Muslim Advocates with the explicit focus of working to protect and defend the civil rights of all Americans. And our two primary focus areas that we started were racial and religious profiling and strengthening the civic sector of the Muslim community. We've done a series of trainings around the country with nonprofit organizations serving the Muslim community that bring together experts to be able to share best practices from the field and to provide resources, legal, financial resources, so that small volunteer-based homeless shelters and domestic violence centers and food banks and clinics have the ability to strengthen their capacity and to be able to withstand the questions and the scrutiny that Muslim donors are going to ask because of the increasing, the chilling effect, essentially, of the rewrite of laws, charitable giving laws. The effect of that has been positive, but the chilling effect remains. With regards to racial and religious profiling, we continue to have a tremendous amount of hope and appreciation for the advocates that have stood up and participate now, actively and strongly and vocally, in challenging the unchecked surveillance that currently is allowed, the impact on First Amendment rights, so that when you re-enter the country or you're traveling, law enforcement or Customs and Border Patrol agents should not be able to ask you if you attended a mosque during your travels or how often you pray. and to challenge the law enforcement notion that conflates religious practice with being prone to violence. These are very real problems. We're sending two very distinct messages. And we're excited and have appreciated the leadership of the Civil Rights Division and the open doors to be able to raise these questions and to raise these concerns. It's had a profound impact, and we're deeply appreciative for the support of our allies, many of whom are in the room. There is a lot of work to be done. I'm excited and hopeful, but I can't help but remember what it felt like back in 1986. Thank you.
I want to thank the organizers for putting forth this panel on this very important topic, particularly Eric Treen, who's been an amazing ally for people of faith and all Americans who care about protecting our country's freedom. Eric has done a tremendous job through two administrations now doing what he does. I'm also very pleased by the strong show of support and presence of leadership here at the Department of Justice and for GW University for hosting this. And of course, it's amazing being on a panel with some very old friends and allies who were standing hand in hand with me on 9/11, and we're really, whether it be Jim or Amber or Ralph, and then Stuart, who I met a few years later, are real heroes of our country for standing up and affirming and working to enforce the laws and freedoms that we stand about. Now, I'm not going to give a completely rosy picture because the issues that have come out of 9/11 in many ways are still with us today. And though I do want to say that I shouldn't be viewed as a pessimist, I'm a very optimistic American, and like Dr. King loves quoting the saying that the arc of history bends towards justice, and I have a real faith that when you're right about an issue, even if it takes more than 10 years, and on some issues it's taken more than 10 years, people in this country, in this institution, the institutions of this country will eventually get it. But you've got to keep at it. So with that, I'm going to give a bit of a personal anecdote, not to just share something very personal or talk about myself, but just to give you a sense of the dynamic on the day of. On the day of 9/11, I was actually, I had an externship at a place called the World Organization Against Torture, and I was on my way there from Arlington into D.C., and I wasn't parked in a great place in Arlington, so I had the faceplate of my radio in the car, and so I didn't really know what was going on. It took me a bit of time to get into D.C. That morning, and I parked my cars parked north on Connecticut Avenue. That organization had just changed offices, and I had forgotten where the office was. So I walked into a building and said, "There's a World Organization Against Torture here," and somebody pointed at me and said to the concierge, "You have to watch out for that guy. He might be trouble." Now, I'm from New York, and I like giving it back to people. If I don't like what they say, it's just part of who I am. But I was in a rush that day because I was late for my internship, so I just kind of kept going, went to the next building, said, "There's a World Organization Against Torture here." And, the response was, "Sir, there have been terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, and the Pentagon's on fire, and we're scared that White House is going to get attacked. Get out of here." My car was parked north on Connecticut Avenue. And I've had too much experience growing up here in America, whether it was my father being told to go back to Iran during the Iran hostage crisis, receiving crank calls during the first Persian Gulf War telling me to go back to Iraq when I was in college, a law school colleague of mine in Cleveland, Ohio, saying to me, your people are going to get a lot of flack for what happened in Oklahoma City before they found out who perpetrated it, or a Sikh house of worship I grew up in getting vandalized after the first World Trade Center attack, to know that I knew we were in trouble. So my car was parked north. I got in my car and started driving back home to New York, New Jersey. And it didn't take about an hour for my mom to finally reach me. And my mother said to me, it was the worst conversation I've had in my life with her, and I just don't particularly enjoy sharing this personal part of my life. But she asked me if my bandana was in the car, and I told her it was, and she said what I expected to say, which was put it on. Now, for a Sikh, taking off their turban is like taking off their head. It's an essential part of their religious identity. So I told her I wasn't going to take off my turban. And I knew what I was saying when I say it. A part of me was saying, no, this is my country. Like, this is not going to happen here. So she pleaded, but I refused. My fiance at the time then called. She pleaded for me to take off my turban and put on a bandana. I wear a bandana when I play sports, and I just said, no, I'm not going to do it. She told me, please don't stop, because the ride back home took about like 6 hours. It usually takes about 4.5 hours. I got hungry, so I wanted to stop at a drive-through at Burger King, and my mom said, please don't stop, please don't stop, please don't stop. Now, mind you, this is before most Americans knew or even heard of the possibility of a backlash. We're still talking 1 o'clock p.m. or so on the day of. But I got back home, and didn't take but an hour to hear that a Sikh gentleman in Richmond Hill, Queens, who had come out of the Gurdwara as a Sikh house of worship to pray for the victims, had been assaulted with a baseball bat severely. By nighttime, we heard that the Gurdwara in Cleveland, Ohio, had been firebombed. In San Mateo, California, a Sikh home had had a Molotov cocktail thrown into the house. In Mesa, Arizona, 5 days later, on September 15th, 2001, Balbir Singh Sodia, a Sikh gas station owner, was shot and killed by someone who thought he was going after the terrorists. In Providence, Rhode Island, a Sikh, and this was all over the news, CNN, NBC, ABC, was arrested off of a Amtrak train for carrying a kirpan, which is usually a small Sikh article of faith, an emblem of justice. It resembles a sword. And the people who as he was being led away, were cheering that somehow a terrorist had been caught. As you can imagine, the charges against him were dropped very soon thereafter, but not without images of a turban and a beard flashing continuously on TV as a threat to our country's national security. In all, the Sikh coalition, which was a baby literally of the day of 9/11, we convened a conference call on the day of 9/11, and the next day issued a press release saying coalition of Sikh organizations in New York grieve about the attack on our country and call on police to protect our community from hate crimes. All in all, we had over 300 reports of bias incidents, whether it be everything from murder, assault, school bullying, workplace discrimination, profiling at the airports, harassment and name-calling on the streets. Over 300 reports from the Sikh community of such behavior in that first month, the first 4 weeks after 9/11, to a website we had set up the day after 9/11 for people to report these types of crimes and or discrimination about. Now, to their credit, Ralph Boyd, who I met on September 16th, 2001, in addition to Jim Zogby at that same meeting, had convened a meeting of community leaders to discuss the backlash, basically. And Ralph in his shop, don't want to embarrass Jim, but his son Joe Zogby was part of the National Origin Working Group that Ralph mentioned. Deepa Iyer, the current executive director of SALT, was a DOJ attorney at that time. Nahid Qureshi, who's the deputy executive director now of Muslim Advocates, was also part of that National Origin Working Group. So some real all-stars in the advocacy world now. Joe's over at Senator Urban's office. Were part of Ralph's team. Meaning that these are people who really cared about these issues, and they really fought hard on behalf of our communities to address what was within the enforcement authority of the Civil Rights Division, particularly when it came to hate crimes, workplace discrimination, when it came to public entities. And then, of course, Chair Dominguez over at EEOC convened, as Commissioner Ishimaru mentioned, a special session of the EEOC, a meeting totally dedicated to the issue of workplace discrimination on December 11th, 2001, exactly 3 months to the date. In addition, and as we had requested, she had created a special tracking code to track post-9/11 discrimination. She had, at our request at that December 11, 2000 meeting, created a special employer's guide to the rights of Arab, Muslim, Sikhs, and South Asians, and reverse a employee's guide to the rights of Arab, Sikhs, Muslims, and South Asians in the workplace. In addition, another great hero of 9/11 was Secretary Norm Mineta. Now, thank God that man, who had experienced the internment, was the head of our Department of Transportation on that day before Department of Homeland Security was created. The Sikh community was being told carte blanche to either remove that turban or you're not going to fly, which was a complete violation of our rights. And it didn't take more than about a month and a half for that DOT team, working under long hours, to put forth regulations that made the air travel experience of Muslim, Sikhs, Arabs, South Asians more respectful of our rights. Now, let me say this. There's a dichotomy, getting to the sort of the more gloomy piece. Now, as a country, we've come to a consensus that there are certain levels of private discrimination, hate crimes, school bullying, workplace discrimination, and the like, that are unacceptable. And there are laws that protect people against that. And to its credit, Ralph and the other heroes I mentioned, Norman Ettick, Chair Dominguez, President Bush, very clearly said that discrimination will not be tolerated, and we will vigorously, and they kept their word, enforce existing laws that undermine these rights in which society has agreed this is unacceptable as with respect to private conduct. But there was public conduct that sent a mixed message to our communities. And let me talk about some of that public conduct very quickly. The Absconder Initiative, which prioritized for deportation people from Muslim countries. Not Poland, not Botswana, not Russia, people from Muslim countries. Special registration, which required people from Muslim countries and only Muslim countries to specially register their lawful presence in this country. Again, not Poland, not Botswana, not Russia, Muslim countries. The special interest detainees, 1,200 people held on immigration violations when they were really subject of a criminal investigation related to the 9/11 attacks. Those 1,200 people were often denied right to counsel. Their detention was not even acknowledged at times by the government. There were no criminal charges, and many of them were deported. Now, of course, the Absconder Initiative turned up no terrorists. Of course, the special interest detainees turned up no terrorists. Of course, special registration, which affected 10,000s of people, 10,000s of Muslims deported from this country, found no terrorists. Now, this is an ugly stain upon our country. It's not American, and eventually it's my hope that our government, because this is what the advocates want, and we heard it loud and clear at two community hearings the Sikh Coalition convened around the anniversary of 9/11, we will get an apology from our government for that behavior, because it's clearly un-American. And oftentimes, to our credit as a country, our inspector generals both in the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security, have taken the government to task on these issues. Now, we're nowhere near the political climate where an apology will happen, but I hope it'll happen. I will quickly touch upon, because I'm over time, some of the more pressing issues right now. On the issue of school bullying, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act does not include religion as a protected class. So if I'm a Sikh and I'm bullied because I'm a Sikh, or I'm a Muslim because I'm bullied because I'm a Muslim, though the Department of Education has some sort of way to sort of get to the issue through national origin discrimination, we're still not a protected class, and that's a huge issue for our communities. Hate crimes. Our Department of Justice still doesn't have a special tracking code for hate crimes against Sikhs. And when you have an issue, like our community does with hate crimes, and the government is not tracking it, well, how do you solve a problem that you're not tracking? And it's something we'd like to see fixed eventually. Workplace discrimination. There's still laws and federal cases out there that have interpreted Title VII to allow for what we call the back of the bus solution, which would allow for which basically, as long as someone's offered the same pay, same benefits, but they're in the back, that's okay because there's no actual, at least according to some courts, injury. You're just working in the back, but you have same pay and same benefits, same opportunities for promotion. Finally, on the issue of profiling, Sikhs feel like they're being profiled unfairly en masse at airports around the country. The Supreme Court's standards out there, many of which were developed in the late 80s, early 90s, are absolutely horrendous. It gives the government carte blanche, and oftentimes we feel like the government is taking carte blanche. So, mixed review. We had some real leadership from Ralph and from Norman Etta and from Chair Dominguez and from President Bush in saying the right things, but we also had some abject discrimination that has to be acknowledged eventually, and of course some issues that still need to be addressed today. So I thank you for this time, and I thank Eric and the team at DOJ for having me here.
Thank you. To go back to that day, which many of my predecessors have done, I was driving to work, stopped in traffic. I guess we all were. Radio didn't work, and a woman in the car next to me was gesturing to roll down my window, and I did. She said, "Have you heard? A plane flew into the World Trade Center. My father works there. I can't get him." And light changed, she pulled off. I never saw her again. I don't know what happened to her father. I think about her a lot. Got to work, the second plane had hit. My office was ordered evacuated. We were a block from the White House, and we were in a zone where they wanted us to leave, but couldn't because we were getting phone calls from people all over the country in the community. The threats had already started, and the hate had started, and people wanted to know what to do. I want to describe to you the difficulty in the sense that 9/11 was something unique, both because it occurred in New York and because it occurred in this age of the power of media to bring intimacy to a situation like that, whether it's a trial that goes on sometimes too long or a tragedy of this sort. We didn't just watch it, we lived it. It was something that became a personal story for every single one of us. And it did for Arab Americans too. It did for everybody in America. It was our national tragedy, and we lived it every day. Never forget the faces of those mothers or wives, girlfriends, sons, daughters, standing in line at CNN, behind the rope, holding up pictures of their loved ones that you knew they'd never find. This was weeks later, but never giving up that hope. I mean, it never stopped being able to bring us to tears because the tragedy just went on and on and on. The organism was in shock. The whole body of America was in shock. And when a body is in shock, it reacts. It reacts in different ways. And one of the ways it reacts is to strike out at threats, real, imagined. It was the second day I got the first death threat. It was Zogby, you Arab dog. You'll die, I'll murder you and slit the throats of your children. It stung. It stung both because of the personal threat of what it represented, but also, you know, as I've described it, we were in mourning collectively as a country. And then someone decided to say to me, you can't be part of this, and pulled me away. I had to look over my shoulder. I couldn't just be part of this process of grief that was engulfing the rest of the country. My office was afraid. We had a lot of non-Arab Americans in the office. They were like, you know, what are we doing here? I mean, this is scary, a scary place to be. We had police protection. DC police were wonderful. It was my son, Ralph, who told me to call you. And I called Ralph and asked him to host a meeting. I actually asked you to do it the following week, and you decided to do it 2 days later. And because we didn't know what was going to happen, because we saw we were like looking this way at the tragedy, that way at the threats, and they were coming in quite rapidly over the phone. We didn't know how to deal with all of them. We knew we needed help. And so what was interesting was that we were dealing with not just the threats, but also the fear that the threats could go way out of control and that we could have a Japanese-American situation on our hands. It was in the middle of all that Senator Kennedy called me, rather gratuitously. Gratuitously in the sense that as the threats were undeserved, so too was the support that we got. So I didn't do anything to deserve the threat. I also didn't do anything to deserve a call from Senator Kennedy, or a call from Senator McCain, or a call from Senator Lieberman, or being invited to a meeting in Senator Kennedy's office, Tom, where he convened a group of us, told us about the legislation that he was going to propose to protect Arab and Muslim Americans, and then followed by the House, and both houses doing unanimously a resolution, then walking from there over to the Japanese-American War Memorial, where there was an event that was to say never again would this happen. And I remember thinking to myself at the time that with all the fear that this could happen again, it couldn't happen again, because there were too many walls of defense. When Japanese Americans were hauled off, the ACLU and the American Friends Service Committee were the only guys around to offer support. But we had 33 national organizations and political leaders from both parties and members of the Senate and the House and religious leadership from across the spectrum. And I remember standing there saying, this couldn't happen again. There are too many people here saying, no, it will not happen. And so it was both sides. It was the threats. I mean, the threats were nothing new. I mean, my life had been threatened before. My office got firebombed in 1980. Never a prosecution ever. Since 9/11, 3 people who threatened my life have gone to jail. I'm not proud of it, but I'm pleased to know that there's somebody there to defend me. I was pleased to know after 9/11 that there were national organizations saying, this will not stand. I was pleased to know that there was a Ralph Boyd and an Alex Acosta, and that I had a Joe Zogby, my son, working in the department together with other Arab American and Muslim Americans who were there to say, this isn't going to happen again. And so the threats came, but so too did the defense. And it stayed a situation with us for a long time. Long time in the sense that the threats trickled, you're right, they went down, but they became replaced with another kind of problem, the kind that, Stuart, you had to deal with, the ones that we had to deal with from a sort of an internalization and a sort of a bringing down to an institutional level, the discrimination in housing and in employment, and more recently in land use, something that Eric, I know, is dealing with, that is the building of mosques, not just in Tennessee, but in several places across the country. And I want to echo what Amber and Amardeep noted, and that is the problems that came from the very people that were protecting us. I mean, the FBI guidelines unleashed a a kind of situation in America that frankly, we had gotten away from 30 years ago, and now are heading back to, with the kind of surveillance and the kind of profiling and the opening of files based on what? Suspicion, that caused me real concern. And the call-ups, the 3,000, the 5,000, the NSEERS program. I mean, the untold story of NSEERS is not the 13,000, 14,000 ordered deported, but it's the 80,000 who didn't register. And the fact that we don't know where they are. They're in hiding, many of them. I know some call the office and say, I just realized I had to register. I didn't know I had to. College president calling saying, I never notified the kids in my school that they had to register. They didn't. This was a program, you're right, Amardeep, it was a shame from the beginning. It was poorly executed, horribly conceived, and the devastating impact on a whole community, and not just those who had to register or didn't register. But when we called the office out in California, and we got it under control, we can do 100 people a day, and they got 800 Iranians showing up the first day, and 700 of them got held over because they didn't know what to do with them. The impact on the entire Iranian-American community was devastating and created fear that spread to all the other targeted groups. You're wrong about one thing. It wasn't just Arabs and Muslims. There were 7 North Koreans that were in that. That was the one country to sort of add to the mix to say, we didn't just discriminate. We actually got the North Koreans in the mix too. It was dumb. Shouldn't have happened. And yes, they've terminated the program, but the residuals of that program are still with us, and we've got to address them too. Not just those ordered deported and families destroyed and broken up. I mean, people who had gotten, during the Clinton years, had applied for residency, change in status, would go into one office and be told, here's my letter, and be told, you don't even have to come. You have a change in status. Would go into another office and be told they were ordered deported. There was no consistency in the way this program was implemented. It was wrong. And if those problems have not gone away, neither has the problem of hate, but hate in a different way. We saw it play out in Murfreesboro, saw it play out over Park 51. Saw it play out, and are seeing it play out in the Republican presidential primary. And let's be clear, I mean, the use of religious hatred as a wedge issue in politics is something we saw in 2010. It hasn't gone away in 2011, and it's something we all have to be aware of, because that kind of hate leads people to violence. We've learned in our history that it happens. And having the validator be a guy running for president is a surefire impetus to some people to take action. We have to be very careful of this. And it's with us, and it's real, and it's something I think we need to address. There's an industry of hate, and it is fomenting hate, and it hasn't gone away. And one of the things that's bothered me, and I know we've raised this with the Department of Justice and we've raised it with the Homeland Security, are the trainers who are going around to FBI offices and agencies in the government and in regional offices of Homeland Security, going around actually conducting programs on Islam or on immigrant communities in America who are part of this industry of hate, whose job it is to defame communities they make a living off of it. A hell of a way to make a job, get a job or something. I guess that's what you do. They are legitimizing hatred, and we have to deal with that one as well. It's something that just cannot stand. I mean, I was invited to Homeland Security. It was wonderful. Myself and Salamo Mariotti and your predecessor. Yes, Dr. Mattson went to Homeland Security to conduct a real session on who Muslims are and who Arab Americans are. And hopefully it's a process that'll be repeated. It's the corrective we need. It's not just, in other words, average folks out in Murfreesboro who need to know who Muslims and Arabs are, but it's folks in law enforcement, and they ought to be learning about it from us and not learning about it from those who've made a profession out of stirring up hatred. Bottom line is, there have always been two Americas, two responses to every crisis. There's the America that responds as Dr. King would respond, as presidents in the past, as George Bush responded, as Hollywood responded after 9/11, to say, we are all one people. We should protect and embrace all who are Americans. But there's that other America. We always have to watch out for it. The America of hate, the America that lynched folks in the South, and the America that won't let mosques be built in their communities. Both of them are real. If we forget the one, the America that embraces and the America that's one, then we give up hope that America can never be the country we believe it can be. But if we forget the other, and we ignore it and pretend it's not there, it just happens to creep up on us time and time again, and we become vulnerable to the threat that it poses to us. 9/11 taught us, not only are there external enemies who hate us and will spare no effort to strike out against us, but there are also different parts to our national character, those who would threaten the national fiber of America, and those who will come together and will bring us together and make us one and make us whole. And a day like today is an opportunity for us to reflect on that, do what we can to inoculate ourselves against the one, but at the same time to encourage the other, because that's the America that ultimately will make us strong. And I thank you.
Amber, I want to start with you. Where could you be elected student council president today in the United States?
If I were 16 again. I share that story because I think that there are a tremendous number of Muslim American students and student leadership who've been emboldened. And I share the story about wondering about what would happen at my high school, and I don't know what would happen at my high school. Things haven't been so great there for kids who are not part of the majority. But that cannot cast a shadow over another reality, which is in the last 10 years, I often felt that, and it was true, that when I was participating in coalitions or working in the civil rights space, that I was either the only or one of two Muslim Americans in the room. That cannot be said anymore. There is an entire generation of American Muslim youth who have been emboldened and inspired to do exactly what you said, Jim. This is my country too. Going to law school, engaging in civic engagement, running for office. Forget student council. We have some amazing young leaders running for local city councils. I just met a city councilman up in Hartford who was just elected, who was very much involved in social justice work. And so I think that one story that's a positive story out of this is that the challenges that we've heard today have inspired a generation to look towards ways of really engaging and participating in an active way in civic life.
Amardeep?
Roy, real quickly, one place you could get elected a city council president actually is Hoboken, New Jersey, where my little brother is the city council president. And I'll tell you, when he ran, they said to him, "How many Sikhs are in Hoboken?" And he said 4. And then they said 4%. He's like, "No, there's just 4." But it doesn't matter. I'm running as a person who happens to be Sikh, and I'll knock on as many doors as possible, but I think folks will get it, and they did.
Excellent. Stuart and Ralph, what did you get wrong in the response post 9/11?
Do you mind going first?
I think part of the difficulty is getting started, trying to react to something where you don't have information, where you don't have relationships built up. And that's one of the struggles that we had at the time and we continue to have. And the question and the challenge for us at the EEOC and other government entities is how do you build up that infrastructure before the problem hits? And how do you collect the information you need to figure out where people are, where needs might be? How do you train your people to respond appropriately, to understand various issues within various communities that might not be the same sorts of things you would see in your everyday life? That's a real challenge for us then and continues to be now, but we're working on it.
Ralph?
Yeah, so this is the hard part for me. The easy part was accepting the generous praise of my colleagues about the work we did in the Backlash context. Frankly, that was easy too. I had long and deep experience as a criminal prosecutor, and frankly, after September 11th, my juices were flowing, and I, as I said in my introductory remarks, was really energized by being able to protect or work to protect vulnerable communities. The more difficult aspect of my work then, and the less, or I should say the more imperfect and sometimes flawed aspect of my work and our work collectively, was how we managed and understood that intersection between our very important obligation to protect America against terrorist threats, while at the same time protecting vulnerable communities from within, and perhaps misunderstanding, misgauging, miscalculating the chilling effect that some of our investigative techniques would have on vulnerable people and vulnerable communities. There are some things that we did that were controversial that I would still do because they are right to do and make sense as a practical matter to do from a law enforcement perspective and a national security perspective. And although they start to creep towards the boundaries of our law and our constitutional principles, they're well within them. And those are some of the things I talked about in the town hall meetings. But there are things that we did and ways we could have done them that would have shown a better appreciation for the fear that was certainly created in many of the communities from some of the initiatives that we undertook from the national security perspective. I attended a town hall meeting in Dearborn, which many of you probably know has the highest population of people of Arab descent outside of the Middle East, I'm told anyway. And when I did the town hall meeting, it seemed that that was true. And it was right after the Attorney General had announced that we were going to ask that certain young men who had entered the United States recently from countries where Al-Qaeda had active operations and were between the ages of 18 and 35 and were in the country on a particular kind of visa, we were going to approach them and ask if FBI agents and other federal law enforcement could ask them questions to try to get information that folks thought could be potentially useful. And so that had just been announced, and then here I am in Dearborn at a town hall meeting of what seemed like thousands. It was supposed to be an hour meeting. It lasted about 3.5 hours. I was doing it, or at least in the beginning, I was doing it with the newly minted U.S. attorney there in Detroit, but about 15 minutes into the meeting, I couldn't find him next to me. But this reflects the hard part of the job at the time. I had, when I talked to people, what I would describe as a no pander rule. And I felt like one of the values that I could add to a situation when there was a difference in perspective and a difference in a point of view about the legitimacy of something that law enforcement was doing, that I was there to actively listen to the concerns and hear those concerns for those elements of the concerns that might have validity and potentially could change how we did things. But my job was also to say when there was difference, to articulate our position and why that difference was there, and to offer some perspective about it. So for example, when talking to the audience in Dearborn about those voluntary interviews, it was my job to convey good information, which was to say those interviews, although we realize even being asked is challenging to people and frightening to many, we think we need to ask, and they are really voluntary. So if you say no, no means no. And what I think we miscalculated is how all of the other things that were occurring might have caused people to question whether there would be actually no consequences from saying no. That's one of the miscalculations.
Let me move to.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah,
So
of
what I
course.
tried to do with the audience was to say, I know this feels creepy, and I know it seems unprecedented, but I can tell you, having been a mob prosecutor in Boston, when we had homicides in Boston, very often when we didn't have any place else to start, we'd start knocking on doors in the community in which the homicide took place. Didn't mean the people on whose doors we were knocking were subjects or targets of our investigation, but it did mean that that seemed to us to be a rational place to start asking questions. And in that community in which that frequently happened, those were thoroughly white communities. So not to say that we don't legitimate your concerns, we don't credit your concerns, but to say this does happen, and it is a law enforcement technique that we have used before, and sometimes successfully.
Amardeep and James, first question is Islamophobia growing? And second is, do you think it is going to last as long as the ingrained prejudice against African Americans?
Yes and no. First, the yes. It is growing, and it's growing because it's being exploited as a political issue. And this is not a partisan statement, it's a reality check. In the last poll we did, American attitudes toward Muslims, Democrats, 55% favorable, 35% unfavorable. Republicans, 12% favorable, 85% unfavorable. There are consequences to when people exploit fear and use it as a political issue. And the reality is that there may have been a division before Park 51, and there was actually in the polling that we had done. But that division has only grown since 2010. And so when you have Republican candidates saying the stuff that they're saying, they're actually playing to a base. It's like the gay marriage of 2010 and 2012 cycle. It's an issue that's being used, as are the Sharia law proposals before several state legislatures, et cetera. It's an effort to exploit that fear for political gain. And as long as it's there, then you're going to see it continue to be used. Is it the same as, and will it have the consequences of what is, in fact, the defining issue of American politics, and that is race? I think not. And I'll also say something here that maybe some folks won't like to hear, but I cannot in any way take out of this equation the fact that we have Barack Obama as president of the United States. When it's a wedge issue because we have a president who, as he might have said at one point, oh, by the way, is African American and has a funny name. And there are people, look, if you've got about a third of the folks on one side who think he's Muslim and don't think he's born here and he's not one of us, et cetera, this is a convenient way around getting at that issue. And I think it's unfortunate. It's worse than unfortunate. But it's something I think we have to collectively deal with, is this effort to delegitimize the president. Muslims got sort of caught in the crossfire on that one, and they're paying a price for it, as he is paying a price for it as well. So this is not going to be, it's not going to create in any way the same kind of legacy as slavery, as systematic discrimination of an entire race of people for the last several centuries. It's a problem. It's a real problem. It's a problem we got to address. It's a problem I think we can solve and deal with. We just need more courageous people. We need somebody on the Republican side to stand up and be an adult, as George Bush was in September and October of 2001, and say, for God's sake, stop it. This is not who we are. But there's been nobody on that side who's had the courage to do it.
Amardeep?
Jim has great polling data and the numbers tell a story. I'll show some other survey numbers we have as an organization that tell a story. Now, what folks kept saying to me in the media and other spaces in the lead up to the 9/11 anniversary was, well, isn't the backlash over now? And there was a horrible backlash right after 9/11, but that's done now. And I said, yes, absolutely. Violent hate crime, employment discrimination, and the like have gone down dramatically and drastically since 9/11. What we now see is more softer, pernicious forms of bigotry and Islamophobia, in particular where the Sikh Coalition works in the spaces we work in is in public schools. We've done surveys in New York and in the Bay Area of over 2,006 students. And interestingly enough, on both coasts, in highly melting parts of America, over 65% of our kids report suffering bigotry. Bigoted name-calling, cat-calling, and the like, 5% of which, by the way, comes from teachers. So that there's a culture right now in our country where calling someone a terrorist or bin Laden or the Taliban is not understood to necessarily be an epithet. My colleague Maha back there from Islamic Networks Groups did a survey of Muslim youth in the Bay Area and found that over 80% of them suffer bigotry in schools from fellow students. So is Islamophobia alive and well? Absolutely, and I would concur with Jim from what we've seen on the ground. It's actually on the rise, and sadly, it's our children. Okay, it's our children, many of whom were hardly even born on 9/11, who are experiencing it as part of their experience of being in America, growing up in a school in this particular moment in our history. So it is growing.
Amber, you want to speak on it?
There are two things that really quickly. I absolutely agree that it's growing. I think it's growing to the point that was made earlier because there is an industry, a very well-funded industry that is propagating fear about Muslims, and it comes in a variety of mediums and forms. In some recent polling, really looking at attitudes about Muslims, and one of the things that was really compelling was the fact that when you say American Muslim, people don't feel as strongly opposed, but when you say Islam and you talk about Islam, the fear and the belief that Islam teaches and promotes violence is extraordinarily high. It's the highest that it's been in 10 years. And there is something about that. When we talk about this dichotomy of messages, this notion that you don't attack the Muslim but fear Islam. Okay, don't attack the Muslim school kids, but fear Islam. And that, until we confront that, this pattern of suspicion that justifies approaches is going to continue to be a problem. The other piece that I want to share, because you raised the issue of race, is that the American Muslim community was 45% are African American or of African descent. And so when we talk about anti-Muslim bigotry in this country, it is connected to race. It is absolutely integrated, I think, in a conversation about race.
Okay. Stuart, you want to?
Well, can I point out one thing about the trends we're seeing? Yes, there was a fall off after 9/11. It peaked, and then, as Ralph pointed out, it went to a valley. But we're finding that it's really not going to a valley, that there are plenty of smoking gun cases still out there where people are talking about terrorism, talking about Islam. It still happens, and it happens in a fair number of cases. And we're seeing, frankly, for us, record number of cases that we're bringing dealing with these issues.
And unfortunately, we are already over time, and it's my job to get us back onto time. So I'd just like to say that I appreciate this panel. I appreciate all of you being here. The Civil Rights Division certainly recognizes that individual acts of hatred against a single person based on religion or national origin affect an entire community, and we hope to continue our work in fighting against that. And at this time, let's thank our panelists.